TIAA is on a mission. Why? Because 54% of Black Americans don't have enough savings to retire. So in collaboration with big-name artists like Wyclef Jean, TIAA released Paper Right, new music inspiring a new financial future. With 100% of streaming sales going to a nonprofit that teaches students how to invest. Stream Paper Right now and help close the gap.
Home Abstract and Title Company was founded in 1867 and is the oldest company still operating in McLennan County. Home Abstract is comprised of a team of honest, friendly, hardworking professionals dedicated to providing both commercial and residential real estate clients with the highest level of communication and service. Their team is committed to working hard and building and maintaining strong relationships because transactions are so much more than just deals. They are clients, deserving of the courtesy, care, and respect that Home Abstract and Title Company is known for. Visit Home Abstract and Title Company at homeabstract.com.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, had left him alone. But
The Waco History Podcast is sponsored by Brotherwell Brewery on Historic Bridge Street in Waco.
cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
Okay, so Waco History Crossroads, our first guest with my co-host, Rick Tullis. Rick, can you introduce our first guest?
Yeah, I'd like to introduce Claire Kultgen MacDonald. So Claire, she grew up Kultgen here in Waco. And Claire, you want to say hello to the audience?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you in. So we're talking about Waco History as Crossroads, and when we thought about some frameworks for that, Rick said, got to have Claire on to talk a little bit just about your family's history and their role and kind of connecting this place to other places.
Yeah, it turns out when you just talk about roads, it puts people to sleep. So we were hoping to bring some personal stories into this and make it real. And your great-grandfather had a ton to do with the development of not only Waco in general, but certainly with the road systems around Waco and in Texas. And so we'd love to give you a chance to talk about that.
Well, I'll do my best to make roads exciting. So, obviously having the last name Kultgen as a kid, the highway has Kultgen on the name as well. And so it's always been something I guess people have tied to our family. So It's a neat legacy. And, certainly I had a nickel for every time somebody brought that up, right? But
what's your daytime job, by the way? So
yeah, well, I always thought kind of the tie was neat that he was a car dealer, but then he started working on the Good Roads project, and then it just kind of tied in naturally with transportation. Not to be, too philosophical, but we feel as car dealers, our role is to provide for transportation needs of our community. And that's kind of what roads do. So it fits together real nicely, just what he did full time and then also his volunteer work.
When you can imagine, it's a little self-fulfilling when you're early in the technology, right? The early part of the 20th century, and you want to sell more cars, but there need to be more roads, right? There was a constraint in the marketplace. People couldn't drive everywhere they wanted to.
Yeah, Jack was from Michigan, and he came down here because of World War I. So I imagine that transportation all the way from Michigan down to Houston at Ellington Field was probably not so pleasant. And then obviously he grew up around Detroit, the mecca of auto dealers. So he's kind of always, I guess, was around cars. And then thankfully the war ended and he tried to find his place in the world, which ended up being the car business.
Right. Well, and not that we're going to think totally linearly here, but Stephen and I had talked a little bit already about the location of Waco and how it was a natural pathway that turned into trails and roads and place for humanity to go north and south in Texas. And I guess we could pick up the story, kind of post Civil War. You start seeing the railroads, they come in, they take on a big chunk of the transportation loads. And it's really the first time humanity can travel faster than a horse and carry more than a horse. So it was very transforming. But then towards the end of the 19th century, the car gets developed, and the first cars get into Texas in the 1890s or So somewhere in there, I think is what I read. And so what would it have been like driving a car in Texas in the early 1900s?
I even think about, if you've ever driven a Model T, they're not very pleasant. And I couldn't imagine driving, and that's on a paved, nice road. I couldn't imagine driving one on a dirt road or lack of road, and just how brutal that must have been.
Yeah. Yeah. The other technology that was coming online at the same time, which created the same problem, was the bicycle. I mean, we don't realize how popular the bicycle was in those days. It was like having a horse you didn't have to feed and clean up after. So, but you had the same limitations. They didn't have the fancy mountain bikes we have today that you could traverse trails with. So,
well, and in those early cars, you were about as exposed to the elements as you are
right.
on a bicycle. And it's not just about roads; it's support. You were just talking about COVID getting parts to fix cars. You had to have a pretty intimate relationship with your car back then because you were probably the mechanic that was going to fix it. Yeah.
Well, and also they were difficult to operate. My great-grandfather used to talk about, he also gave lessons when people were buying their first car because they didn't know how to drive one, let alone, they were more tractor-like. So I suspect people knew at least how to work on the magnetos, things like that. But how to drive a car was part of the car buying process for a lot of people in the early years.
Right.
We're still doing that today. It's just more teaching people about the adaptive cruise control and all the technology.
Right.
So they know how the steering wheel works, but all the other stuff, there's a lot of learning still.
Yeah, I think there's a good analogy there. I'm thinking about stuff in our lifetime. The early computers, right? Mm-hmm. If you were an early computer aficionado, you built your own computer. And so it wasn't until the mainstreaming of, through Apple and through these other, that we could just go down to a store and buy one.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess cars went through that same evolution. You really had to want one and know how to work on it to keep it going.
Well, I'd love to hear more about just what he told you about I'm fascinated with the car business as well. So what he kind of told you maybe about the early car business in town.
Well, all my memories of him are, secondhand. I have just a few.
Mm-hmm.
He died when I was pretty young, but, so I hear all the stories
mm-hmm.
through someone else. But, I think when the stories that are repeated the most are about the hard times of World War II and how they overcame that and how the dealership was able to survive those sorts of things, just as other dealerships were. And then also, it's always interesting to me that, he wasn't college educated. He wasn't super wealthy. But he had such an interesting position in so many Waco things.
Mm-hmm.
And car dealers back then seemed to have a really interesting voice in the community. And, definitely that, I think, kind of, if you go into a lot of communities that had dealerships back then, the car dealer was kind of a central voice in what the community was working on and where they were trying to progress things. So
mm-hmm.
kind of interesting. He wasn't the only car dealer that really helped his community. I think talking about bumpy roads, as I was reading back through my oral history book here, LaSalle was kind of where the I-35 thing kind of started.
Okay.
LaSalle was dirt back then, apparently, and there was a bridge over the Brazos, and they were trying to get LaSalle paved. And as part of those meetings, somebody said, hey, if you ask them to have I-35 go through town, you could probably get LaSalle paved all at the same time. And that those two projects were kind of what started, I guess, the conversation and what ended up getting both LaSalle paved and getting I-35 to go through Waco down kind of that Highway 81 route, I guess.
Yeah. So at that point, Jack was involved statewide in some organizations, if I remember that right. The, what was it? The good...
I believe it was Good Roads Association.
Good Roads Association. Yeah. How about that? They were.
Makes
they set a low bar. They didn't want great roads. They just wanted good roads.
Just paved. Well, I think there was the Good Roads Association. I'm not an expert on that, but then there was also the Waco Chamber had a roads committee, and he was the chair of the roads committee. And I think those two projects, and then Governor Conley appointed him to be on the Highway Commission. So that's how I think it all kind of led. And then he was on that for, I think, 8 years. And for 3 of those years, he was the chairman. And it was during that time in the 60s that they really kind of finalized the interstate plan that Eisenhower had started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so his involvement in that, of course, is why I crossed his road coming over here.
According to my dad, who's much more astute on history than I am, there was a city manager at the time named David Smith, I believe.
Yeah.
And he just decided to name it the Jack Kultgen Freeway and did. There was no voting. There was no policy. He made some signs and he wouldn't put the signs up. And that's always been the story of Mr. Smith decided and put up a sign, and so it was.
That's funny. Well, I mean, as you think about in the business that you're in with kind of Waco's relationship to other places and Waco's Crossroads, I mean, I think of it from a historical angle, but how do you think about kind of how Waco's positioned?
Well, I guess, growing up here and being a native, I just think about the suspension bridge and our legacy there of cattle drives, and this is how you got across the river. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of why Waco got on the map, was all going back to that bridge. Mm-hmm. And then obviously we just kind of expanded on there.
Yeah, we talked about the Austin Avenue Bridge the Washington Avenue Bridge was the first automobile bridge that Waco got. That was built for automobile traffic, I think 1904. Mm-hmm. And so, I think of all those bridges as kind of marking, the interstate bridges, the Herring Avenue Bridge. They each kind of have a different segment of kind of Waco's history and the story that you can tell through those crossings of bridges.
And that LaSalle Bridge is actually the Jack Kultgen Bridge. There's not a sign on it anymore, but I think that was kind of the, when they were able to pave LaSalle and get that bridge, made a little nicer, that was kind of a nice thing he did. He was more, I think, interested in the LaSalle project, and the interstate just kind of tacked onto that, and then that led to the appointment on the Highway Commission and exactly where is I-35 going to go. My understanding is there was the federal effort and Eisenhower's plan was to make it go around the major cities, mm-hmm. and then most of the local politicians wanted it to go through their cities. And there was a big kind of back and forth on that. And eventually, it did go through Dallas and Waco and Austin, San Antonio, so you can obviously tell it ended up going through most of the major mm-hmm. cities. And then another thing I was always told was that highway, is it 81? I don't know this highway.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were running out of money. So that highway's already almost built to the interstate standards. So that was one of the reasons they were able to get it through Waco as well, because they could just kind of use that segment from Hillsboro down to about Temple mm-hmm. and save a bunch of money on that.
Yeah. So we've jumped kind of into I-35 a little bit, and one of the predecessors to that, we talked about this early evolution of the technology, cars and bicycles and wanting roads. Historically, there was this thing called the Meridian Highway. It got called a couple different things. That was the brainchild of some guys in Kansas that saw this opportunity. If they could create a named road that ran north and south from Mexico to Canada, and if you can imagine being back then, again, an emerging technology that needed these roads in these cities, I believe saw this as economic development, right? You wanted to be on a major road. Most of these guys were not but a generation or so away from when railroads mm-hmm. came through. And so they'd seen the evidence of what happened when the railroad came through your town versus when it didn't.
Yeah.
So I'm sure some of these guys had the foresight to go, man, we want these major roadways, highways, connection points to come through our city and be an economic driver. So those guys in Kansas, they created an association. They got with each of the states, and if you look at that map, if you Google the Meridian Highway and look at that road, Waco is a fork in that road. So one element then goes down to Houston, Galveston, goes down to that major port city, and the other one goes south, just where we down to Laredo, like we see the road go down there today. And so again, we were at this major crossroads, and if you look at how it's drawn, it doesn't naturally follow, like you were just saying, doesn't follow the interstate today. When it comes through Waco, kind of takes a jog back to the west and then back over. But I think at the time they were just trying to put together whatever best paved roads they could find mm-hmm. to make it the most navigable. But over time that changed.
Yeah, and I think there were these standards, and I haven't read much about them, but the standards that it had to be X wide and X weight bearing and those sorts of things. And then Eisenhower, obviously, one of his lenses was the defense capability, mm-hmm. and I'm sure one of you can probably talk more towards that on what his requirements were. But I know, every so many miles he wanted to stretch long enough that it could be an alternative landing site, and that was a big part of the plan for his funding, that they had to try to, as they were piecing these roads together, they had to find straight enough pieces in order to get the federal funding. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, they wanted alternative landing sites, and they were also really concerned about evacuation routes in case bombs were dropped, atomic bombs were dropped. They wanted to clear evacuation routes, one place out of the other. In fact, this is an aside, but when I was in Arizona, their biggest concern was if there's a bomb dropped in California, all the Californians, heading east, what do they do? Because I think of, these these roads are opening up new networks of travel that were really unforeseen of before. Yeah.
One of the things that I've wondered is, the Eisenhower's defense view, and since he didn't want it to go through cities, was that also a defensive strategy to make sure that these roads wouldn't be destroyed? If you've ever been to historic Europe or whatnot, there's still the damage from World War II where the cities were bombed just because of their location, not for any other reason. So if your roads were far enough away from the cities, there's some protection there for both the city and the road.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a great scene at the in one of the later episodes of Band of Brothers where they're traveling up to the Bavarian Alps and the German army's coming. They're on the Autobahn. So these guys who've been slugging through the mud and through France and parts of Germany, now all of a sudden the army's driving down these beautiful highways in the Autobahn, and it was really a stark contrast. And that's one of the things I always heard too, was once the Eisenhower saw their road network and how great it was another part of that inspiration to bring that back to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes sense that one of the major generals from World War II, as he's developing our major interstate system, thinks about it through a military perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. And it also was a way to get funding in the 50s.
Correct.
I mean, if you could connect it to the Cold War, you could get funding for it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about these road networks, if I looked at a Rand McNally driving map from 1912-ish time range.
Cool.
And it showed the
again, Rick sold his business. I don't know if we led with that. This is what
This
he's
is
doing.
what
these are
retirement
sleep
looks like.
aids
Yeah.
I use at night. So on this map from 1912, it was really a railroad map, but they had kind of drawn red lines where you could actually take cars. And when you looked at it, Waco had 8 of these lines coming into the hub of Waco. You can think of the roads now, what would be 84 and 71 and 77 and or whatever. Yeah, I'm thinking I-35 coming in and out of Waco. And it was a stark difference when you looked around the state. The other cities, most of them had 3, 4, 6 maybe. It really does look, when you look at it, this crossroads idea, that Waco was in the middle of the state and had the most connector roads coming into it, at least at that time. I mean, obviously, the landscape's changed, but definitely helped with our theme on Crossroads.
Yeah. No, I think it's very central.
It's kind of funny. I bought an electric vehicle a few weeks ago, and now I'm, kind of experimenting in that. And there are certain places that are easy to go because I can recharge my truck. And there are certain places like Fredericksburg that are not as easy to get to because of the infrastructure. And so, is this the modern transportation infrastructure step as we, as EVs find a place within our transportation needs? The chargers are another piece of, you can have great roads, but if you have no charger, you can't really get from here to there.
It's another step in the Meridian Road concept, right? The cities that are more forward thinking and get more chargers set up and have that ability to service more vehicles coming through are going to generate more economic activity.
Well, I think that's fascinating historically. I mean, you'd been concerned about watering holes early on, and then at one point you may be concerned about gas stations. But now the fact that you can't go if there's not an infrastructure, the road is there, but everything else you need is not. That's really interesting. So, how are you liking it so far?
There's so many things I like about it I didn't expect to like about it.
Uh-huh.
I've been blessed to drive a lot of good trucks.
Yeah.
But it's so smooth and quiet. it's so fast. That's the word that shocks me. I have to almost pay attention to make sure I don't floor it because it'll really push you back in the seat.
Yeah.
And it tows really well. That was an unexpected surprise. I tow things a lot. That was really nice to see that. I mean, it's really smooth because, there's the transmissions. There is no transmission. It's just smooth and quiet. I've got little kids, so a few quiet moments are really pleasant for me.
Well, what do you use to drown out the kids?
You
should have to turn the music up
that's
now.
just noise.
Yeah.
I
Yelling,
don't even
the
know.
yelling.
Yes,
Yeah.
they drown themselves out. They drown each other out.
Yeah.
Rick mentioned the Meridian Highway. We'll put that picture in the show notes if you want to go take a look at the Meridian Highway, because it is a fascinating image that you shared with me. So,
Yeah. Okay, let me take us back into Old Waco.
Okay.
And we've really been talking about the highways more or less coming in and out, but the paving and things along that nature really happen more in the urban areas than outside of these towns. So some of more of my late night reading, the Municipal Handbook of Waco from 1911.
Are you going to read that description that's in the front of those, which is awesome? Yeah.
Well, there's a report on here, a municipal report on all the different parts of the city and what's going on, but there's one on streets and sidewalks. So I thought it would take us back just a little bit into what that world looked like. So quoting from the book, the most wonderful stride the city has made in municipal improvements has been along the lines of permanent streets and sidewalks, storm and sanitary sewers. I think the sewers are really important myself. From the beginning, the commissioners have centered their energy in this direction, and crusade after crusade was made for building sidewalks. Where 5 years ago there were practically no sidewalks in Waco, but little more than a mile of permanent paved streets, with the exception of the graveled ones. Today, we can boast of 60 miles of cement sidewalks, 35 miles during the past 2 years were done, and 62 miles of beautifully paved streets. The record of sidewalk permits shows that for the year just finished, Waco built more cement sidewalks than any other city in Texas. How about those bragging rights?
Wow.
Now, there's a inventory of which streets are actually paved. And so I think this is interesting because it tells us a little bit about Waco back then. Now, when we say paved, we all think nice asphalt roads, right? So brick. A lot of these were paved in brick, and if you've gone through small town Texas anywhere, you can still find those old brick paved roads. But pretty much all of downtown, it's talking about Franklin and Mary and Jackson Streets, Washington, Bridge Street, the Square. Those were all paved in bricks. And then they had a lot of roads that were they called it macadamized, and that was really just an angular gravel packed down really tight. So it was better than dirt and mud, right? When it rained, it actually shed off the water, but wouldn't be what we consider paving now. And then they did have some roads, probably the nicer ones, that were bitulithic paved, and that's more like a modern asphalt. And so that included streets like Austin Avenue, parts of Washington, Herring, Columbus. So those are the roads that got the better stuff. So
interesting, yeah. And that's when the reservation is still helping pay for some of those sidewalks and roads.
Yeah, I don't know what the how they collected those taxes, but yes, we'll assume that.
Yeah, if you run over right now, they're tearing up Elm Avenue, and one of the fascinating things is they're pulling up the old brick, and that brick probably went in the 1920s, but they're pulling up the old brick, and they're also finally pulling up the old interurban rail lines that are going up Elm Avenue. They just paved over them at some point, and so the city has said they're going to reuse that brick for something, but it's brick that goes back to the late 1920s, I think.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
But yeah, it would have been a rough ride. Suspensions systems in automobiles were not. It's basically a stagecoach with an engine.
Yeah, big leaf springs and big wheels. Try to smooth out the ride as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, going from a Model T to a Model A was a huge leap forward, but still nothing like what we have today. And then when you get into the 30s, Fords, I mostly know a little about the Fords. We had major shortages from the Great Depression still. So those vehicles really were rough to ride in, very, pretty rough. And then the 40s came in and we had more, we stopped making cars for the war. So not until the 50s did we really get decent automobiles. And then the 60s, of course, the great automobiles came. But riding over rough roads and rough vehicles for a long time, I don't envy those journeys.
It's amazing how quickly it happens. I think it's by the 1920s that you could really call at least one car a necessity, not a luxury anymore. Like every family in the U.S. in this area would need to have an automobile. But there was also kind of the cultural and social acceptance. There's a little bit of a stir when they enclose automobiles just because of the space it creates for, kind of a moving closet. And who do you have in your closet, and what does it mean to invite someone into your closet, and what proper people go into the closet and don't go into the closet. Created all these sorts of social and kind of cultural concerns. It's very interesting, the history of it. So.
Every time I see the rumble seats in those old cars, I think, well, that seems a little quieter to put your children back there, a little behind you. They can't get to you from back there, but it's also right on the axle. So I bet they, again, that's not the preferred seat for me.
Right. One of the things we're seeing in modern times is the updating of the interstate that's going on for our listeners, probably enjoying that right now as you go down I-35. I think we're widening to 4 lanes. Is that in certain areas? Updating the access roads. 3 to 4, yeah. Eliminating some of the off ramps, especially around the downtown area, because of the higher speed of vehicles now, and just it's a different landscape.
All underpasses, no overpasses, or trying not to do overpasses, just underpasses.
Right,
so,
right. So we still move forward. Yeah,
certainly it's worth acknowledging, though, the incredible job those teams have done of that project. Really beautiful, seemed to go pretty well and ahead of schedule. That's pretty unheard of in most projects these days. So we are very blessed, I think, to have just an incredible road that just opened up, going great. And then the Highway 6 project, which I've got a front seat view of every day, also seems to be completely on schedule. And while it's a mess, it's really needed. They're adding, I believe, 11 bridges in that area between the malls. So huge project, but they're already clipping along at the pace they plan to, and it's really going to be needed. And just a great addition, I think, especially with all, the chamber has added so much commercial, so many businesses to the industrial park back there. And just to be able to have all that access so that all these businesses can come in from across the world. They're recruiting worldwide businesses to Waco because of the transportation benefits here.
Yeah, it's been a logistics hub for many years for a lot of companies, and that tends to be a lot of the businesses that get recruited or that want to move here is because we're 3 hours away from 20 plus million people in the state of Texas. So it's it's a great hub to have to come out of. I'll tell you one of the things. In fact, just recently, I was in a meeting with city and county and community leaders, and we were just thinking about, okay, what are some of the things, the top things we need to be thinking about, right? If we want to be like Jack Kultgen and all the differences he made in our community, because he obviously had vision to see things that needed to happen, whether it was Lake Waco or the road systems and several other things he worked on. What are those things we need to be thinking about? And as you can imagine, with a lot of the growth that's happening in Texas and Waco in particular, roads is top of mind, and making sure the great commute times that we all get to enjoy now, that doesn't go away. And so I know it's a challenge to endure through a road project on your front door at your business, but in the long run, it's going to be a great asset.
I'm interested going back, Claire, you mentioned his investment in the LaSalle project. Why do you think that was so important to him at the time?
I don't know that that was a big project for him. I think it was just that's what the chamber was working on, and he was on that committee. But I think it was the funding, and somebody gave him a tip. He was very good and very involved in politics, so I think it was the tip of, hey, tie these two projects together.
I see,
and that'll allow them both to go the right way. So I think it was all politics and bundling of projects.
The old bundle negotiation tactic.
Yeah. But I mean, the circle was so kind of central to operating in the area and so iconic. I think for traffic coming in and out of Waco.
Yeah.
Back in the day.
Yeah. I mean, it is the epitome of a crossroad.
And it's still, people still haven't figured out how to navigate it. I'm frustrated daily with people's approach to the circle, which is completely wrong. That solid white line means something. Don't cross it.
Yeah, this is your opportunity to educate and remind people one more time.
It's the people that need to hear it that aren't listening.
Yeah, so. Okay.
Well, I think there were a couple other points you wanted to bring up on the Crossroads. Stephen, what do you got?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different directions. We haven't talked about the river much. We haven't talked about the other places in particular that Waco has a relationship to. I think we'll get into more of that as we get into our series. I think we're off to a great start here. I'm looking forward to unpacking this as we go. It is something I think that has been true from the beginning. I mean, when I initially think of Crossroads, I think back to Horn Rock Shelter, which is this great archaeological site that's between here and Lake Whitney, where they've discovered very, very important burials that go back 10,000 years, and just that's been happening in this region. I mean, we're doing it in a new way, right? We're doing it in electric vehicles and looking for charging stations, but it's been happening in this region for thousands of years, and so it's just interesting to see all the things that means to us as Wacoans. So it'll be fun to unpack together.
Agreed. Claire, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This has been a Rogue Media Network production.